Tony Delucci thought he was grabbing an easy payday off a Harlem street corner. Just another rich kid whose family would pay to get him back. But when he made that ransom call, the voice on the other end went cold, and someone whispered two words that turned his blood to ice. Bumpy's boy. In that moment, Tony realized he hadn't just kidnapped a teenager. He'd signed his own death warrant. Now, before Tony's world falls apart, here's something wild. 99% of you watching right now haven't hit subscribe. I know you're out there, from New York to London, maybe Mumbai or Sao Paulo. Do me a favor and let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and while you're down there, go ahead and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Tony Delucci wasn't a made man, but he wasn't small-time either. He ran a tight operation out of the Bronx, specializing in a particular kind of work that the bigger Italian families didn't want to dirty their hands with directly. Kidnapping, not the headline-grabbing, FBI-involved kind. The quiet kind. The kind where you grabbed someone, made a call, collected the cash, and everyone went home. No violence necessary, just business. By 1963, Tony had pulled off 11 successful jobs. 11 families who paid up, got their loved ones back, and kept their mouths shut because that's how things worked. His targets were always carefully chosen. Wealthy, connected enough to have money, but not connected enough to bring down serious heat. Businessmen's kids, gamblers who owed the wrong people. Occasionally, a wife or daughter of someone who needed to be taught a lesson about payment schedules. Tony's crew consisted of 4 guys. Sal, his cousin, who drove and kept watch. Mickey and Paulie, 2 thick-necked enforcers who handled the physical work. And Johnny, who managed the safe houses and made sure nobody could trace anything back to them. They worked like a machine, each man knowing his role, nobody getting greedy, nobody talking. The operation had rules. Never hurt the merchandise unless absolutely necessary. Keep the ransom demands reasonable enough that people would pay rather than gamble with the police. Move fast, stay quiet, and most importantly, know your territory. That last rule was the one Tony broke. Harlem in 1963 was changing. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum. The neighborhood was vibrant with culture and music, but it was also rigidly controlled. Tony knew the Italian families had arrangements up there, knew there were black operators running their own games, but he figured there was always room for one more score. He'd been watching the neighborhood for weeks, identifying potential targets, learning the rhythms of the streets. What Tony didn't understand was that Harlem wasn't just another neighborhood. It was a kingdom, and kingdoms have kings. His previous jobs had all been in Italian neighborhoods or neutral territory, places where his family name, even if he wasn't made, carried some weight. Places where the rules were understood. But Tony was getting ambitious. He'd heard about the money flowing through Harlem, seen the cars and the clothes, and figured a quick job up there would set him up for months. Tony's mistake was thinking all money was equal. That a kid in Harlem was the same as a kid in Little Italy or the Upper East Side. He didn't understand that the neighborhood had its own power structure, its own laws, and its own enforcers who didn't answer to the 5 families. He was about to get an education in territorial politics that would cost him everything. The decision to move on Harlem came after a slow summer. Tony's usual hunting grounds had gone quiet, either because word had spread or because people were being more careful. He needed a score, and Harlem looked ripe. He'd driven through a few times, spotted some promising targets, and convinced himself this would be just like any other job. His crew wasn't so sure. Sal had voiced concerns, said they should stick to what they knew, but Tony overruled him. Mickey and Paulie didn't care one way or the other as long as they got paid. Johnny, who was usually the cautious one, didn't push back hard enough. Looking back, Tony would realize that everyone's hesitation should have been a warning. But greed is a hell of a blindfold. October 15th, 1963. A Tuesday afternoon, warm for autumn, with that golden light that makes Harlem's brownstones look like they're glowing. Tony was parked on 143rd Street, watching the corner store on 145th through binoculars. He'd been surveilling this spot for 3 days, and he'd finally found what he was looking for. The kid appeared like clockwork every afternoon around 3:30. 17, maybe 18 years old, tall and lean, with a confident walk that suggested he'd never been afraid of anything in his life. What caught Tony's attention wasn't just the kid himself, but everything about him. The clothes were expensive, tailored pants and button-down shirts that weren't off any rack in a department store. The shoes were leather, polished. The watch on his wrist caught the sunlight. This was a kid with money, which meant a family with money. What made him perfect was the pattern. Every day the kid would leave school, stop at this corner store, buy a soda and a newspaper, then sit on the stoop outside for exactly 20 minutes, reading and watching the street. No bodyguard, no friends hanging around, no car waiting. Just a teenager enjoying the afternoon, completely unaware that he was being hunted. Tony watched the routine, timed it, studied the street traffic and foot patterns. The corner was busy enough that a car pulling up wouldn't look suspicious, but not so crowded that witnesses would be a problem. The kid's solo routine made it even easier. No one to fight, no one to chase, just a quick grab and go. On the third day of surveillance, Tony gave the green light. He briefed the crew that night at a diner in the Bronx. Tomorrow, 3:30, they'd take him. Sal would drive, bringing the car up alongside the kid at exactly 3:50. When he'd be finishing up and getting ready to walk home. Mickey and Paulie would handle the extraction, quick and clean. Johnny would have the safe house ready. 48 hours later, they'd be $50,000 richer, and the kid would be back with his family with nothing worse than a scare. What Tony didn't know was that this particular corner, this particular store, this particular kid was watched by more eyes than he could count. Harlem had a network. An invisible web of shopkeepers, street vendors, shoe shiners, and residents who reported everything they saw to the man who ran things. And this kid wasn't just any teenager. He was protected, valued, and his safety was guaranteed by the most dangerous man in New York City. But Tony didn't know that yet. All he knew was that tomorrow he'd make his move, collect his payday, and add another successful job to his record. He went to sleep that night confident, maybe even a little excited. In less than 24 hours, his entire world would collapse. October 16th, 1963, 3:47 in the afternoon. The black Cadillac pulled up to the curb on 145th Street exactly on schedule. Sal was behind the wheel, engine running, eyes scanning the street. In the back seat, Mickey and Paulie sat ready, the rear door already slightly ajar for a quick exit and entry. The kid was right where he was supposed to be, sitting on the stoop, newspaper spread across his lap, a bottle of Coca-Cola sweating in the October warmth beside him. He looked relaxed, absorbed in whatever article he was reading, completely oblivious to the predators closing in. Tony, sitting in the passenger seat, gave the nod. Paulie stepped out first. Casual, like he was just stretching his legs. He walked past the kid, then turned back, positioning himself to block any escape route down the sidewalk. Mickey came out next, moving fast but not running, straight toward the target. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Mickey grabbed the kid by the arm, yanking him up from the stoop. The newspaper scattered, the Coke bottle tipped over, fizzing onto the concrete. Paulie had his other arm, and together they walked him quickly toward the open car door. Not dragging, not causing a scene, just two men helping a friend who'd had too much to drink. A technique they'd perfected. What stopped Tony's heart for just a second was the kid's reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. No screaming, no fighting, no panic. The kid looked at Mickey, then at Paulie, and his face remained completely calm, almost bored. Like this was an inconvenience rather than a life-threatening situation. "You're making a mistake," the kid said quietly as they pushed him into the back seat. Not pleading, not threatening, just stating a fact. "Shut up and get in," Mickey growled, shoving him across the seat and climbing in after him. Paulie followed, sandwiching the kid between them. The door slammed shut. "Go," Tony said, and Sal pulled away from the curb, smooth and steady, not too fast, nothing to attract attention. Just another car in Harlem traffic. Tony turned in his seat to look at their prize. The kid sat there, hands in his lap, looking out the window like he was on a Sunday drive. No tears, no begging, no demanding to know where they were taking him. The composure was unnerving. "What's your name?" Tony asked. The kid turned to look at him, and for the first time Tony saw something in his eyes. Not fear. Something else. Recognition, maybe. Or pity. "You really don't know who you just grabbed, do you?" the kid said. Mickey backhanded him across the face, not hard enough to do damage, just enough to establish dominance. "He asked you a question." The kid's head snapped to the side from the impact, but when he turned back, there was still no fear. He touched his lip, checked for blood, found none, and smiled slightly. "My name's Teddy," he said, "and you've got about 2 hours before everyone in this city knows what you did." "Nobody saw nothing," Paulie said, but Tony heard the uncertainty in his voice. "You think so?" Teddy asked. "Mrs. Patterson in the window above the store saw. Mr. Chen inside saw. The shoeshine guy across the street saw. The kids playing stickball on the corner saw. And you know what they're doing right now? They're making phone calls." Tony felt something cold settle in his stomach, but he pushed it away. The kid was just trying to rattle them, trying to make them panic and let him go. It was a smart play, he had to admit, but it wouldn't work. "It doesn't matter who saw," Tony said. "By the time anyone figures out what happened, we'll have our money and you'll be home. So just sit tight, keep your mouth shut, and nobody gets hurt." Teddy laughed, a short, humorless sound. "You really have no idea, do you?" The drive to the safe house took 35 minutes, winding through the Bronx to a nondescript warehouse building that Johnny had set up weeks ago. The whole ride, Teddy sat in silence, watching the city pass by the window. His calmness was starting to get under Tony's skin. Every other person they'd grabbed had been terrified by this point, crying or pleading or trying to negotiate. This kid acted like he was waiting for a bus. When they pulled into the warehouse, Johnny was waiting inside. He'd prepared a room in the back, nothing fancy, just a chair, some rope, and a cot in case this took more than a day. The space was soundproof, isolated, perfect for their needs. They walked Teddy inside, and he went without resistance, sat in the chair when told to sit, let them tie his hands behind his back without protest. The whole time, that same calm expression, like he was humoring them. "You comfortable?" Tony asked, a edge of sarcasm in his voice. "I've been worse places," Teddy said. "You got any water?" Johnny brought him a glass, held it to his lips so he could drink. The kid thanked him politely. "All right," Tony said, pulling up a chair to sit across from Teddy. "Let's talk about how this works. You're going to give me a phone number, someone who can pay to get you back. We're going to call them, tell them what we want, and if they're smart, they'll pay up. 2 days from now, you're back home, we're gone, and everyone forgets this ever happened. Simple." Teddy nodded slowly. "You want my father's number?" "That's usually how it works, yeah." "Okay," Teddy said, "but when you call, be respectful. My father doesn't like rudeness." Something about the way he said it made Tony's skin prickle, but he grabbed a pen and paper anyway. "What's the number?" Teddy recited it, and Tony wrote it down. A Harlem exchange, which made sense. "What's your father's name?" Tony asked. Teddy smiled again, that same strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. "When you call, you'll find out." Tony waited until evening to make the call. 6 hours after the snatch, long enough that the family would be worried, but not so long that they'd have gone to the police. Timing was important in this business. You wanted them desperate, but not irrational. He stood in Johnny's office in the warehouse, the phone number written on a piece of paper in front of him, practicing what he'd say. He'd done this 11 times before, had the script down cold. Firm, but not threatening. Businesslike, making it clear this was a transaction, not a negotiation. Sal, Mickey, Paulie, and Johnny stood around him, watching. They'd all done this before too, knew the routine. Get the family on the hook, make the demand, set up the drop. Easy money. Tony dialed the number, each rotation of the dial feeling heavier than it should. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. Yes? The voice was male, older, with a tone that Tony couldn't quite place. Not worried, not frantic, just waiting. "I have something that belongs to you," Tony said, using his standard opener. "A boy, about 17, goes by Teddy. He's safe, he's unharmed, and he'll stay that way as long as we can come to an arrangement." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Tony could hear breathing, could hear what sounded like other people in the background, murmuring voices that went silent when someone made a gesture. "Where did you find him?" the voice asked. Still calm, too calm. "That doesn't matter," Tony said. "What matters is, where did you find him?" The tone hadn't changed, but something in it made Tony's mouth go dry. He glanced at his crew, saw his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. "Corner store on 145th, Tony said. "Look, we're not looking for trouble here. We just want 145th and what?" "Lenox Avenue," Tony said. "Now listen. What time?" "What? What time did you take him?" Tony's hand was starting to sweat against the phone receiver. 3:50. Why does that... And you brought him where? The Bronx? How could he possibly know that? Tony hadn't said anything about location, hadn't given any details that would... "Who is this?" Tony demanded. "Put the boy's father on the phone." Another pause. Then, in the background, Tony heard someone speak. A voice he couldn't make out clearly, followed by a sharp intake of breath from multiple people, and then one word spoken by someone in that room, whispered but audible through the phone line. One word that changed everything. "Bumpy." Tony's blood went cold. "What did you say?" The man on the phone spoke again, and this time his voice carried an edge like a razor. "You asked for the boy's father. You're speaking to him. My name is Ellsworth Johnson. Most people call me Bumpy. And you just kidnapped my son." The phone almost slipped from Tony's hand. Around him his crew had gone pale. Sal was shaking his head, backing away. Mickey had his hand over his mouth. Paulie looked like he might throw up. We didn't know," Tony stammered. "No," Bumpy Johnson said. "You didn't. And that's going to be a problem for you." Tony's mind was racing. Bumpy Johnson. The Bumpy Johnson. The man who ran Harlem like it was his personal empire. The man who'd stood up to Dutch Schultz, who'd gone toe-to-toe with Lucky Luciano, who'd sent more men to early graves than Tony could count. The man whose reputation was so fearsome that even the 5 families treated him with respect. And Tony had kidnapped his son. "Mr. Johnson," Tony said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is a misunderstanding. We didn't know who the boy was. We'll bring him back right now. No harm done. Is my son hurt?" "No, sir. Not a scratch. We haven't touched him, I swear." "Did you hit him?" Tony glanced at Mickey, remembered the backhand in the car. "There was... in the car? One of my guys, he just... So you did touch him?" "It was nothing, just... Where are you?" Tony didn't answer, couldn't answer. Telling Bumpy Johnson where they were would be suicide. "Here's what's going to happen," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to something quiet and deadly. "You're going to keep my son exactly where he is. You're not going to move him. You're not going to touch him again. You're going to make sure he has food and water and whatever else he needs. You understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Tomorrow night, midnight, you're going to bring him to Marcus Garvey Park. You know where that is?" "Yes." "Northeast corner. You're going to come alone, and you're going to bring Teddy. And then we're going to have a conversation about what happens next. Mr. Johnson, please, we didn't—" "Midnight," Bumpy said. "Don't be late. And if anything happens to my boy between now and then, I will find everyone you've ever known, and I will make sure they understand the price of your mistake." The line went dead. Tony stood there, phone in hand, staring at nothing. Around him his crew erupted. "We're dead," Sal said. "We're fucking dead." "We gotta run," Paulie added. "Get out of the city tonight, right now." "He'll find us," Mickey said. "You think we can hide from Bumpy Johnson? He's got people everywhere." "Shut up," Tony shouted. "All of you, shut up and let me think." But there was nothing to think about. They'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd taken the son of the most powerful black crime boss in America, a man who'd built an empire on loyalty and fear, a man who couldn't let this slide without looking weak. Running might buy them time, but Bumpy's reach extended far beyond New York. Killing the kid would guarantee a manhunt that wouldn't stop until every one of them was dead. Going to the meet was probably a death sentence too, but at least it gave them a chance to plead their case. Tony walked back to the room where Teddy was being held. The kid was still sitting in the chair, still calm, like he'd known exactly how this would play out. "You knew," Tony said. "The whole time you knew what would happen." Teddy shrugged. "I tried to tell you. You're the ones who didn't listen. Why didn't you say your father was Bumpy Johnson?" "Would you have believed me?" Teddy asked. "Or would you have thought I was lying to scare you?" He had a point. "What happens now?" Tony asked. "Now?" Teddy said. "Now you wait, and tomorrow night you meet my father, and if you're smart you'll pray he's in a forgiving mood." Tony walked out of the room and closed the door. His crew was still arguing, still panicking, but he tuned them out. He was trying to remember everything he'd heard about Bumpy Johnson, trying to calculate the odds of survival. They weren't good. That night, while Teddy slept peacefully in the back room and the crew argued about escape plans, Tony sat alone in Johnny's office and tried to understand the magnitude of what he'd done. He needed to know who he was dealing with, needed to understand the man who now held his life in his hands. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another criminal, he was an institution. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in South Carolina in 1905, he'd moved to Harlem as a teenager and quickly learned the streets. The nickname Bumpy came from a bump on the back of his head, a physical quirk that became synonymous with power. By the 1930s, he was working for Stephanie Street, Claire, the queenpin of Harlem's numbers racket, protecting her operation from white mobsters who wanted to take over. When Dutch Schultz, one of the most violent gangsters of the era, tried to muscle in on Harlem's rackets, Bumpy stood up to him. While other operators folded or fled, Bumpy fought back, orchestrating hits and protection schemes that kept Schultz's men bleeding money and men. The conflict only ended when Schultz was murdered in 1935, and many credited Bumpy with making Harlem too expensive for the Dutch to hold. After that, Bumpy's reputation grew. He worked with Lucky Luciano and the Italian families, but always as a partner, never as a subordinate. He controlled the numbers, the drugs, the protection rackets, and he did it with a combination of intelligence and brutality that kept everyone in line. But what made Bumpy different, what made him more than just another gangster, was his relationship with the community. While he was ruthless with competitors and traitors, he was protective of Harlem's residents. He bankrolled local businesses, paid for kids to go to school, made sure families had food during hard times. He was called the Robin Hood of Harlem, and while that might have been romanticized, there was truth to it. He didn't allow hard drugs in certain neighborhoods. He didn't tolerate violence against women or children. He had rules, and those rules made him beloved even as he ran criminal enterprises. To cross Bumpy wasn't just to cross a gangster, it was to cross a man who had an entire neighborhood loyal to him. Tony learned all this from Sal, who'd grown up hearing stories, and from Mickey, who had a cousin who'd done time with one of Bumpy's guys. The more they talked, the worse it got. "I heard about this guy who stole from one of Bumpy's numbers runners," Mickey said. "They found him in the Hudson, but not before Bumpy made an example of him. Broke every bone in his hands first, so everyone would know what happened when you steal." "That's nothing," Sal added. "You remember Johnny Torrio's nephew tried to set up a heroin operation in Harlem without asking permission? They found him alive, but he couldn't talk anymore. They'd cut out his tongue." "Jesus Christ," Paulie muttered. "And that cop, the one who was shaking down shop owners on 125th Street, Johnny said, just disappeared. No body, no evidence, nothing. But everyone knew Bumpy handled it." The stories went on, each one worse than the last, painting a picture of a man who was methodical, patient, and absolutely merciless when crossed. Bumpy didn't kill in the heat of anger. He killed to send messages, to maintain order, to ensure that everyone understood the consequences of breaking his rules. And Tony had taken his son. "What about the Italian families?" Tony asked. "Won't they step in? We're Italian. Doesn't that count for something?" Sal laughed bitterly. "You think the families are going to go to war with Bumpy Johnson over you? You're not even made, Tony. You're nobody to them. If anything, they'll serve you up on a platter to keep the peace." He was right. The arrangement between the Italians and Bumpy was built on mutual respect and non-interference. Bumpy stayed in Harlem, the families stayed in their territories, and when they did business together, it was as equals. No family would risk that relationship to save a low-level operator who'd been stupid enough to grab the wrong kid. "So what do we do?" Paulie asked. Tony didn't have an answer. Every option led to the same place, a bullet or a beating, death or permanent disfigurement, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in back rooms and dark alleys. "We go to the meet," Tony finally said. "Tomorrow night, Marcus Garvey Park, like he said. We bring the kid back safe, we apologize, and we hope Bumpy's feeling generous." "And if he's not?" Mickey asked. Tony met his eyes. "Then at least we die with a little dignity instead of running like cowards." The crew didn't like it, but they didn't have a better plan. Sal said he was going to visit his mother just in case it was the last time. Paulie wrote a letter to his wife. Mickey got drunk. Johnny just sat quietly, smoking cigarette after cigarette, staring at nothing. Tony checked on Teddy one more time before trying to sleep. The kid was awake, lying on the cot, hands still tied but looking comfortable enough. "You all right?" Tony asked. "I'm fine," Teddy said. "You?" Tony almost laughed. "I've been better." "For what it's worth," Teddy said, "my father's not unreasonable. You didn't hurt me. You're bringing me back. That counts for something." "You think he'll let us walk?" Teddy was quiet for a moment. "I think he'll do what he thinks is right, and what sends the right message." That wasn't comforting. Tony left him there and went back to the office. He tried to sleep but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bumpy Johnson's face, heard his voice on the phone, that calm, deadly tone that promised violence. He thought about his 11 successful jobs, about all the times he'd pulled this off without a hitch. How had he gotten this unlucky? What were the odds that out of all the kids in Harlem, he'd grabbed the one kid who was untouchable? But it wasn't luck. It was ignorance. He'd walked into someone else's territory without understanding the rules, without paying respect, without doing the basic research that might have saved him. He'd seen money and grabbed for it, and now he was going to pay the price. As dawn broke over the Bronx, Tony made a decision. If this was going to be his last day, he wasn't going to spend it cowering. He'd meet Bumpy Johnson, face whatever came, and accept the consequences of his mistake. It was the only option he had left. While Tony and his crew spent the night in panic, Teddy Johnson lay on the cot in the back room, perfectly calm. This wasn't bravado or shock. It was training. From the moment he could walk, Bumpy Johnson had been preparing his son for the reality of their world, not to take over the business necessarily, but to survive it. To understand that being Bumpy Johnson's son made him both protected and targeted, that there would always be people who saw him as leverage, as an opportunity, as a way to hurt the most powerful man in Harlem. Bumpy's parenting style was unusual. He didn't shelter Teddy, didn't keep him locked away in some safe house with bodyguards. Instead, he let him walk the streets, go to school, live a relatively normal life. But that freedom came with lessons. If someone ever grabs you, Bumpy had told him when he was 12, you don't fight, you don't run, you stay calm, you watch everything, you remember faces and voices and details. Because the people who take you, they're already dead. They just don't know it yet. Your job is to stay alive until I find you. Teddy had taken those lessons to heart. When Mickey and Paulie grabbed him off the stoop, his first instinct was to look for cameras, to note the license plate, to memorize faces. When they put him in the car, he paid attention to the route, counted turns, estimated time and distance. By the time they reached the warehouse, he had a pretty good idea where he was. More importantly, he knew his father already knew where he was. Because what Tony didn't understand, what no outsider could understand, was the network Bumpy had built. Harlem wasn't just territory, it was family. Every shop owner, every street vendor, every kid playing stickball was part of an information system that reported back to Bumpy Johnson. Mrs. Patterson, watching from her window above the corner store, had seen the grab. She'd called it in before the Cadillac even turned the corner. Mr. Chin had gotten the license plate. The shoeshine guy across the street knew Sal by sight, had seen him casing the area for 3 days. The kids playing stickball had followed the car for 2 blocks on their bikes before losing it, but they'd noted the direction. Within 30 minutes of Teddy being taken, Bumpy knew what had happened, who had done it, and roughly where they'd gone. Within 2 hours, he knew exactly which warehouse in the Bronx, knew the layout, knew how many men were inside. He could have sent his people in immediately, could have stormed the place and killed everyone involved. But Bumpy was a strategist. This wasn't just about getting his son back. It was about sending a message, about showing the entire criminal underworld what happened when you violated the most basic rule: you don't touch Bumpy Johnson's family. So he waited. Let Tony make the call, let him sweat, let the fear build. Teddy understood this because his father had explained it to him. Sometimes the threat of violence is more powerful than violence itself, Bumpy had said. You let a man imagine what might happen to him, and his mind will come up with worse things than you ever could. While Tony's crew panicked in the other room, Teddy actually slept pretty well. He knew his father's men were watching the warehouse, knew that if anything went wrong, they'd come through those walls like the wrath of God. But he also knew his father wanted this played out a certain way, and Teddy's job was to stay calm and let it happen. In the morning, Johnny brought him breakfast: eggs, toast, coffee, better than Teddy expected. "You want me to untie you so you can eat?" Johnny asked. "That'd be nice," Teddy said. Johnny hesitated, then untied his hands. Teddy rubbed his wrists, took the plate, and started eating. He could have tried to run right then, could have fought, but there was no point. This was all going to end tonight, one way or another. "Can I ask you something?" Johnny said. "Sure. What's he like? Your father?" Teddy thought about it while he chewed. "He's strict, fair. He expects a lot, but he gives a lot too. He's the smartest man I know, and the scariest. But he's a good father." "You think he's going to kill us?" "I think that depends on you," Teddy said. "You treated me okay, gave me food, water, didn't rough me up. That'll count for something. What about the others?" Teddy remembered Mickey's backhand in the car. "That'll count too." Johnny nodded slowly and left the room. The rest of the day passed slowly. Teddy could hear the crew moving around, their voices tense and clipped. He heard arguments, heard someone crying at one point. The fear was eating them alive. As evening approached, Tony came in to check on him. "We're bringing you home tonight," Tony said. "To your father." "I know. I want you to know this wasn't personal. We didn't know who you were. I know that too." Tony shifted uncomfortably. "Will you tell him that?" "That we didn't know." Teddy looked at him steadily. "I'll tell him exactly what happened. How you grabbed me. How your guy hit me. How you treated me after you found out. All of it." "That's fair," Tony said quietly. "My father will decide what happens next," Teddy added. "But if you're asking for advice, I'd say be honest. Don't make excuses. Don't try to minimize what you did. Own it, apologize, and accept whatever he decides. You think that'll make a difference? I think it's your only shot." Tony left, and Teddy went back to waiting. A few hours later, as midnight approached, they untied him completely and walked him out to the car. The same Cadillac, the same crew, but this time the dynamic was different. Teddy wasn't a prisoner anymore. He was cargo being delivered, and the men around him knew they were escorting their own potential executioners. The drive to Marcus Garvey Park was silent except for Sal's labored breathing. Mickey kept checking his gun, then putting it away, then checking it again. Paulie stared out the window. Tony sat rigid in the passenger seat. Teddy watched the city pass by, watched the neighborhoods change as they crossed from the Bronx back into Harlem. Coming home. He thought about his father, about what he'd do, And despite everything, Teddy felt sorry for these men. They'd made a mistake, a huge one, but they hadn't known. Ignorance wasn't an excuse, but it was something. Still, Teddy knew how this world worked. Mercy was rare, and examples had to be made. His father had built an empire on respect, and that respect couldn't exist without consequences. As they pulled up to Marcus Garvey Park, Teddy could see figures in the darkness, shadows that moved with purpose. His father's men, surrounding the area, making sure there were no surprises. The reckoning was about to begin. Marcus Garvey Park sat in the heart of Harlem, a stretch of green and rock that rose above the surrounding streets. At midnight on October 17, 1963, it was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before violence. Tony pulled the Cadillac to a stop at the northeast corner, exactly where Bumpy had specified. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Beside him, Sal was breathing like he'd just run a marathon. In the back, Mickey had his gun out, though what good it would do him, Tony couldn't imagine. "Put that away," Tony said. "We're walking into an ambush," Mickey protested. "We're walking into a meeting," Tony corrected, "and if you pull that gun, we're all dead before you can fire a shot." Mickey looked like he wanted to argue, but he slid the gun back into his waistband. Teddy sat between Mickey and Paulie, looking out the window at the park. "They're already here," he said calmly. "Who?" Sal asked. "All of them." Tony looked around but saw nothing, just shadows and trees and darkness. But he believed Teddy. If Bumpy Johnson wanted to fill this park with his men, Tony wouldn't see them until it was too late. "All right," Tony said. "Teddy, you're coming with me. The rest of you stay here." "The hell we are," Paulie said. "You're not going out there alone." "Bumpy said come alone. That's what I'm doing." "Take me," Sal said quietly. "If this goes bad, you'll need someone watching your back." Tony looked at his cousin, saw the fear in his eyes, but also the loyalty, and felt something crack in his chest. They'd been through a lot together, pulled off jobs that should have gotten them killed, and here they were at the end, still looking out for each other. "Okay," Tony said. "You and me. Everyone else stays." He got out of the car and Sal followed. Tony opened the back door and gestured for Teddy to step out. The kid did, straightening his shirt, looking remarkably composed for someone who'd just spent 24 hours as a kidnapping victim. They started walking into the park, Tony on one side of Teddy, Sal on the other. The paths were empty, the playgrounds deserted. The only sound was their footsteps and the distant hum of the city. Then, as they reached a clearing near the center of the park, figures began to emerge from the darkness. They came from all directions, stepping out from behind trees, rising from where they'd been crouched in the shadows. Men in dark coats, 15, maybe 20 of them, forming a loose circle around Tony, Sal, and Teddy. None of them had weapons visible, but Tony knew they were armed. And then Bumpy Johnson stepped into the light. He was taller than Tony expected, maybe 6'2", broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit with a burgundy tie. His face was weathered, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see everything. The bump on the back of his head that gave him his nickname was barely visible in the darkness, but his presence was undeniable. He walked slowly, deliberately, his men parting to let him through. His eyes were locked on his son. Teddy stepped forward. "Hey, Dad." Bumpy's expression didn't change, but Tony saw something flicker in his eyes. Relief, maybe. Or love. He reached out and pulled Teddy into a brief embrace, then held him at arm's length, checking him over. "You hurt?" "No, sir. I'm fine." "They treat you all right?" Teddy glanced back at Tony. "After they figured out who I was, yeah. Before that, one of them hit me in the car, but nothing serious." Bumpy's jaw tightened. "Which one?" "The bigger guy, Mickey. But he didn't know, Dad. None of them knew." Bumpy looked at Tony for the first time, and Tony felt like he was being dissected. Those eyes saw everything, the fear, the regret, the desperate hope for mercy. "Step back, Teddy," Bumpy said quietly. Teddy did, moving to stand with his father's men. One of them, an older man with gray hair, put a hand on Teddy's shoulder protectively. Bumpy turned his full attention to Tony and Sal. "You're Tony Delucci," he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir. And you? He looked at Sal. Sal Delucci, his cousin. Bumpy nodded slowly. You grabbed my son off 145th Street yesterday afternoon, threw him in a car, tied him up, held him in a warehouse in the Bronx. Then you called me and demanded money for his safe return. That about sum it up? Tony's throat was dry. Yes, sir. You know who I am? I do now. But you didn't when you took him. No, sir, if I had known. But you didn't, Bumpy interrupted. You came into my neighborhood, into my territory, and you took what was mine without knowing who you were taking from. That ignorance, Tony, is that supposed to make me feel better? No, sir. Because it doesn't. It makes me think you're either stupid or disrespectful, maybe both. Tony wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain, but he remembered Teddy's advice. Own it. Don't make excuses. You're right, Tony said. We were stupid. We should have known better, should have done our homework before operating in Harlem. We didn't, and that's on me. Bumpy studied him for a long moment. Why'd you pick him? Out of all the kids in Harlem, why my son? He looked like money, Tony said honestly. The clothes, the watch, the pattern. We thought he was an easy target. And you never thought maybe there was a reason a kid could walk around Harlem dressed like that without anyone bothering him? Never thought maybe he was protected? I should have, Tony admitted. I didn't think it through. No, Bumpy said. You didn't. He began to pace, hands clasped behind his back, and everyone watched him. The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of his footsteps on the path. I built something in Harlem, Bumpy finally said. Not just a business, but a system. Rules that everyone understands. You don't steal from your neighbors. You don't hurt kids. You don't disrespect the people who live here. And most importantly, you don't come into my territory without permission. He stopped pacing and faced Tony again. Those rules keep the peace. They keep the violence controlled, keep innocent people safe. And when someone breaks those rules, I have to respond. Not because I'm angry, though I am, but because if I let it slide, the rules don't mean anything anymore. You understand what I'm saying? Yes, sir. So here's my problem, Bumpy continued. You took my son. You hit him. You scared him. And every person in Harlem knows about it by now. They're watching to see what I do. If I let you walk away, what message does that send? Tony didn't answer. There was no good answer. But, Bumpy said, my son is safe. You didn't really hurt him. And when you found out who he was, you didn't panic and do something stupid. You brought him back. That counts for something. Hope flickered in Tony's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. Teddy tells me you treated him decent once you knew, Bumpy continued. Fed him, gave him water, didn't rough him up. That counts for something too. He walked closer until he was standing right in front of Tony, close enough that Tony could see the flecks of gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes. But someone has to pay, Bumpy said quietly. That's not negotiable. So the question is, who and how much? Tony felt Sal tense beside him, but he kept his eyes on Bumpy. It was my operation, Tony said. My decision to come to Harlem, my plan, my mistake. Whatever happens, it should happen to me. My crew was just following orders. Bumpy nodded slowly. Loyal. I respect that. But your crew carried out those orders. They grabbed my son. They tied him up. One of them hit him. They're not innocent. No, sir, Tony agreed. But they're not the ones who made the call to come here. That was me. Bumpy considered this, then turned to one of his men. Bring the other one. Two of Bumpy's men walked back toward the Cadillac. Tony heard car doors opening, heard muffled protests, and then Mickey was being dragged into the clearing, Paulie and Johnny following with their hands up. Which one hit my son? Bumpy asked. Tony didn't answer, but Teddy pointed. Mickey, the big one. Bumpy gestured, and two of his men grabbed Mickey, holding him by the arms. Mickey struggled, but they were strong, and he couldn't break free. Please, Mickey said. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who he was. But you knew he was a 17-year-old kid, Bumpy said, and you hit him anyway. It was just to shut him up, to make him... To make him what? Afraid? Compliant? You thought putting hands on a child would make you look tough? Mickey's face went pale. Bumpy walked up to him, and even though Mickey was bigger, he seemed to shrink in the older man's presence. "I have a rule," Bumpy said. "You don't hit kids. Not my kid, not anyone's kid. That's a line you don't cross." He nodded to his men, and they dragged Mickey away, out of the clearing. Tony heard him start to beg, his voice rising in panic, and then there was a sound like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef, and Mickey's voice cut off with a choked scream. The beating continued for maybe 30 seconds, each impact making Tony flinch. When it stopped, Mickey was dragged back into the clearing and dropped at Bumpy's feet. He was conscious but curled in a fetal position, blood running from his nose and mouth. "Both hands," Bumpy said. Tony understood what was about to happen and closed his eyes. There were 2 sharp cracks, the unmistakable sound of bones breaking, and Mickey screamed again. "That's for putting your hands on my son," Bumpy said calmly. "You'll heal, eventually. But every time you look at those hands, you'll remember this night." He turned back to Tony. "Your cousin stays with you, the other 2. He gestured to Paulie and Johnny. "They leave New York, tonight. They go to Jersey or Philly or anywhere else, but they don't come back. If I see them in this city again, I'll assume they didn't learn their lesson." "We'll leave," Johnny said quickly. "Tonight, right now." Paulie was nodding frantically, helping Mickey to his feet. Bumpy wasn't done. "You," he said, pointing at Tony. "You and your cousin. You're going to understand something very clearly. This," he gestured at the park, at his men, at the darkness around them. "This is mercy. I'm letting you live because my son came home safe and because you showed some honor by taking responsibility. But you're going to pay for that mercy." "How?" Tony asked. "You're leaving New York, too," Bumpy said. "You've got 72 hours to settle your affairs and then you disappear. California, Florida, I don't care where. But you don't operate in New York again. Not in Harlem, not in the Bronx, not anywhere. This city is closed to you." Tony nodded. It was better than death. Barely, but better. "And before you go," Bumpy continued, "you're going to spread a message for me. You're going to tell every criminal you know, every operator, every wannabe tough guy, that Harlem is off limits, that Bumpy Johnson's family is untouchable, that the rules exist for a reason and breaking them has consequences. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." "Good." Bumpy looked at each of them in turn, his gaze heavy. "Now get out of my park. Get your friend to a hospital, get your things together, and get gone. If I hear you're still in New York after 72 hours, we'll have another conversation, and it won't end with you walking away." Tony grabbed Sal's arm, and together they helped Mickey toward the car. Paulie and Johnny were already running, practically diving into the Cadillac. As they reached the vehicle, Tony looked back. Bumpy was standing with Teddy, one hand on his son's shoulder, watching them leave. Even from a distance, Tony could feel the weight of that gaze, the power and the warning in it. They drove away fast, Sal behind the wheel, Mickey groaning in the back seat. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. The only sounds, Mickey's labored breathing and the engine. Finally, Sal broke the silence. "We're alive." "Yeah," Tony said. "We're alive." But he knew they'd never be the same. By sunrise, Tony Delucci was already packing. His apartment in the Bronx had never been much, just a place to sleep and count money, and it took him less than 2 hours to gather everything that mattered: clothes, cash, a few photographs, his mother's rosary. Everything else could burn for all he cared. Mickey was in a hospital in Queens, registered under a fake name, his hands in casts and his ribs wrapped tight. The doctors said he'd heal, but it would take months, and his hands would never be quite right again. Every grip, every handshake, every time he tried to make a fist, he'd remember the price of ignorance. Paulie and Johnny had fled immediately after dropping Mickey off. Tony heard later that they'd made it to Philadelphia, then kept going south to Baltimore. They'd sent word through an intermediary that they were done with the life, that they'd found straight jobs and weren't coming back. Tony didn't blame them. Sal stuck around to help Tony settle things. They collected debts, closed out accounts, paid off the few people they owed. They moved through the Bronx and Lower Manhattan like ghosts, keeping their heads down, avoiding eye contact. Word had already spread about what happened in Marcus Garvey Park, and the looks they got ranged from pity to contempt. On the second day, Tony met with a connected guy named Gino, someone who'd helped fence merchandise from previous jobs. "You're lucky to be breathing," Gino said over coffee in a diner. "I know. Bumpy could have made an example of you, could have hung you from a lamppost in Harlem and left you there for days. But he let you walk. He broke Mickey's hands." "Mickey's lucky he's got hands," Gino said flatly. "You grabbed Bumpy Johnson's kid. The fact that any of you are alive is a miracle." "He wants us gone," Tony said. "Out of New York." "Then go," Gino advised. "And don't come back. Bumpy's got a long memory, and he's got people everywhere. You think you can lay low for a year and sneak back? You can't. Someone will see you, someone will talk, and you'll disappear. Permanently." Tony believed him. That night, he started making calls, reaching out to contacts on the West Coast. A guy in Los Angeles said he could find Tony work. Nothing glamorous, just collection and enforcement for some local operators. It wasn't the kidnapping business, but it would pay the bills. "What about you?" Tony asked Sal on their last night in New York. "I'm going with you," Sal said. "Family sticks together." "You don't have to. This wasn't your mistake." "You're my cousin," Sal said simply. "Where you go, I go." Tony felt his throat tighten. He didn't deserve that kind of loyalty, not after what he'd put them through, but he was grateful for it. On the 72nd hour, they were on a plane to Los Angeles. Tony watched New York disappear beneath the clouds and felt something close to relief. He'd lost his city, his operation, his reputation, but he'd kept his life. Given what could have happened, that seemed like a fair trade. The story of Tony Delucci's mistake spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. It was told in bars and back rooms, in prisons and social clubs, always with the same moral: know your territory, respect the power structure, and never, ever touch Bumpy Johnson's family. For Tony's crew members who stayed, the endings were less kind. 2 weeks after the incident, Paulie was found dead in a Baltimore alley, stabbed 17 times. The police ruled it a robbery, but Tony knew better. Someone had decided that Pennsylvania wasn't far enough, that Bumpy's message needed reinforcing. Johnny lasted longer, making it almost a month before disappearing in Atlantic City. His body was never found, but a bartender later reported seeing him talking to 2 men in sharp suits the night he vanished. The description matched Bumpy's people. Only Mickey survived, working as a security guard in Jersey, his broken hands a constant reminder. He never spoke about what happened, but sometimes at night, Sal heard through the grapevine, Mickey would wake up screaming, reliving that moment in Marcus Garvey Park when Bumpy's men shattered his bones. As for Bumpy Johnson, the incident only added to his legend. The story demonstrated both his reach and his restraint, his capacity for mercy balanced against his unwillingness to let transgressions go unpunished. Criminal operators across New York, regardless of ethnicity or affiliation, took note. The Italian families appreciated how Bumpy had handled it. He could have started a war, could have used Tony's stupidity as an excuse to strike at Italian operations, but he hadn't. He'd punished the guilty, sent a message, and maintained the peace. It was exactly the kind of calculated response that made Bumpy a respected partner rather than an adversary. Within Harlem, Bumpy's status grew even higher. The community had watched one of their own get snatched in broad daylight, and they'd watched Bumpy get him back without involving the police, without exposing anyone to legal trouble, just pure force and strategy. Mothers on 145th Street pointed to where Teddy was taken and told their children, "That's why we have Bumpy. He keeps us safe." Teddy himself seemed remarkably unaffected by the experience. He went back to school, kept his same routine, still stopped at that corner store every afternoon. If anything, the kidnapping had validated his father's teachings, proven that the calm confidence Bumpy had instilled in him wasn't just theory, but necessary survival skill. Years later, when journalists and writers asked Teddy about the incident, he'd downplay it. "I was never really in danger," he'd say. "My father knew where I was the whole time." And it was true, but it missed the point. The danger wasn't to Teddy. The danger was to anyone foolish enough to think they could touch him. In Los Angeles, Tony rebuilt a smaller, quieter life. He did collections, ran some bookmaking operations, stayed away from kidnapping entirely. Sal worked with him, and together they made enough to get by. They never talked about New York, never reminisced about the old days, never mentioned that October night when they'd stood in Marcus Garvey Park and felt death breathing down their necks. But Tony thought about it. Every day he thought about it. He thought about it when he read in the papers that Bumpy Johnson had died in 1968, collapsing in a Harlem restaurant at the age of 62. He thought about going back to New York for the funeral, paying respects, but decided against it. Even in death, Bumpy's shadow was long, and Tony didn't want to test whether the prohibition on his return extended beyond Bumpy's life. He thought about it when he saw young criminals making the same mistakes he'd made, thinking they were smarter than the system, thinking territory didn't matter, thinking ignorance was an excuse. He wanted to grab them, shake them, tell them the story of how he'd kidnapped the wrong kid and barely survived. But who would believe him? And even if they did, would they listen? Mostly, he thought about it late at night, when the memories were sharpest. The calm in Teddy's eyes when they grabbed him. The cold voice on the phone revealing who they'd taken. The long walk into Marcus Garvey Park, surrounded by shadows. Bumpy Johnson standing there, impeccably dressed, radiating power. The sound of Mickey's hands breaking. And the lesson that came too late but stayed forever. In the criminal world, knowledge is survival, territory is sacred, and some people are untouchable for a reason. Tony Delucci lived another 30 years after that October night, dying of a heart attack in a modest Los Angeles apartment in 1993. At his funeral, which only a handful of people attended, Sal gave a brief eulogy that didn't mention New York, didn't mention the operation, didn't mention Bumpy Johnson, but everyone there knew the story. It had become Tony's defining moment, the thing that explained why a man who'd been rising in the criminal ranks ended up running penny-ante bookmaking operations 3,000 miles from home. The story itself outlived both Tony and Bumpy, becoming a cautionary tale passed down through generations of criminals. The details changed in the telling. Sometimes Tony grabbed Bumpy's daughter. Sometimes there were more crew members, sometimes the confrontation in the park was more violent, but the core lesson remained consistent. Know who you're dealing with. Respect the territory. Understand the power structures. Because in the underworld, ignorance doesn't protect you, it condemns you. Teddy Johnson went on to live his own life, stepping away from his father's world and becoming a legitimate businessman. He rarely gave interviews, rarely spoke about his father or that October afternoon when he was 17. But when asked, his answer was always the same. "My father taught me that fear and respect aren't the same thing, but they often walk together. Those men who grabbed me, they learned to fear him. They should have learned to respect him first. That's the difference that mattered." As for Harlem, it changed over the decades. Neighborhoods gentrifying, old power structures crumbling, new ones rising. But for those who knew the history, who understood the delicate ecosystem of crime and community that Bumpy Johnson had built, the memory remained. There's a corner on 145th Street where an old store used to stand, now replaced by a coffee shop that serves $7 lattes. Sometimes, older residents walking by will pause, remember, and tell their grandchildren about the day someone tried to grab one of their own, and how Bumpy Johnson made sure it never happened again. The stoop where Teddy sat reading his newspaper is gone. The warehouse in the Bronx was demolished in the 1980s. Marcus Garvey Park still stands, though the trees have grown and the paths have been repaved. On quiet nights, some claim you can still feel the weight of that October confrontation, the moment when one man's mistake became a legend. Tony Delucci's story isn't unique. The criminal world is full of men who made bad calls, who crossed the wrong people, who paid the price for their ambition or their ignorance. What makes his story worth remembering is how cleanly it illustrates a fundamental truth. Power isn't just about strength or ruthlessness. It's about information, preparation, and understanding the landscape you operate in. Tony had strength. He had a crew, weapons, experience. What he didn't have was knowledge. He didn't know that the teenager on the stoop was watched by 100 eyes, protected by an invisible network, valued beyond measure by the most dangerous man in Harlem. That ignorance nearly cost him his life and did cost him his city, his career, and his future. The real question, the one that Tony wrestled with for 30 years, was whether he could have known. Whether there were signs he missed, warnings he ignored, research he should have done. And the answer, the one that haunted him until his death, was yes. He could have asked around, talked to locals, done basic reconnaissance beyond just timing patterns. He could have noticed that a 17-year-old walked those streets without fear, that shop owners watched him with affection rather than suspicion, that the neighborhood seemed to shift around him protectively. He could have wondered why such an obvious target had never been targeted before, but he didn't. He saw money and grabbed for it. And that greed, that lazy assumption that all paydays were equal, destroyed everything he'd built. In the end, Tony Delucci's greatest crime wasn't kidnapping Bumpy Johnson's son. It was doing it without knowing who Bumpy Johnson was. And in a world where information is currency and ignorance is fatal, that was unforgivable. The lesson stands, carved into criminal history by broken hands and abandoned cities and lives lived in exile. Before you make your move, know the board, know the players, know the consequences, because the cost of learning too late is a price very few survive paying.